Red Sea Hokey Cokey, the top risk for shipping businesses in 2026, and a booming dark fleet market. All these stories and much more on the latest episode of Maritime in Minutes. Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor at Seatrade Maritime News here, with our January news roundup, Maritime in Minutes, and I'm joined as usual by our correspondent, Gary Howard. We'll be discussing the shipping news stories that stood out for us over the last month. Now, if we were hoping to gently ease into the new year, the world had other plans, and it's been all go for the team at Seatrade Maritime News so far. So, Gary, can you kick us off by taking us back to the first week of January, which seems quite a long way off now?
Indeed it does. Happy New Year, Marcus, I guess, as far as Maritime in Minutes goes. Carbon capture is one of the most promising technologies for shipping's net zero future. There was a project by the Global Centre for Maritime Decarbonisation that's highlighted a regulatory issue that could prevent the full benefit of carbon capture and utilisation being realised by ship owners. Initial results of this trial on board Evergreen's 18,000 TEU Ever Top were released in June last year, and I believe I covered those as well. GCMD have followed up with a full analysis of the value chain, which saw 25 tonnes of CO2 captured on board the ship, liquefied, transferred to a tanker, and then to a truck in port, which took the cargo by road over 2,000 kilometres to be used in the production of low-carbon calcium carbonate. Looking at that value chain with the assumption that the C2 is simply stored away long term, I guess using something like the Northern Lights project under the North Sea, actually brings a net increase in CO2 emissions for this project. However, by using the captured CO2 in an industrial process and offsetting those typical carbon intensive inputs like calcium carbonate, the value chain creates emission savings over its length. Unfortunately, the IMO guidelines recommend attributional life cycle analysis, which does not take into account this offsetting part. GCMD also highlighted there was a series of improvements that could be made to this value chain, many of which were inefficiencies from running a first of its kind project. A waste heat recovery system on the vessel would have brought improvements, and there are some obvious benefits to be had from switching the land segment of the CO2's journey to something less carbon intensive than trucks and a 2,000 kilometre journey. Yeah, that's my first pick for 2026.
Yeah, carbon capture is something there's quite a lot of interest around, and I think it's one of those things with the IMO net zero framework discussions that you mentioned there about the guidelines that they've got and how they don't necessarily encourage it in the way that perhaps many would like it to be.
Exactly, yeah, that's the worry that GCMD had, that it's going to deter investment in the technology.
Yeah, well, let's hope that doesn't happen. Now, I'm going to show something very different for my first pick, and that was a casualty report by Singapore's Transport Safety Investigation Bureau into the collision between the Singapore-flagged product tanker Hafnia Nile and the dark fleet VLCC Ceres 1 off the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia on the 19th of July 2024. And that report highlighted the issue of seafarer fatigue and painted a real picture of the hours and work and rest issue that the industry has. The report looked at the collision itself and did not dwell upon why the Ceres 1 was anchored where it was in the first place, and that's actually an issue I'm going to come back to later in this episode regarding the dark fleet. But coming to the casualty report, it revealed that the second mate, who was officer on watch on the Hafnia Nile, had less than 2 hours of uninterrupted rest in a 38.5-hour period, before then commencing the midnight watch. It also followed overnight travel and immediate assumption of duties upon joining the vessel, and his rest was disturbed by an unannounced fire alarm testing. During the approach to the Ceres 1, the second mate left the bridge to do administrative work, leaving an able seafarer on watch. The AB had also signed on the same day and undertook the duty shortly after arrival following overnight international travel. The report said that with only 2 hours of rest in a 38.5-hour period, the second mate was likely experiencing fatigue, which may have reduced his alertness, affected his performance and judgment during the developing close quarters situation, contributing to what it described as the occurrence. Compounding the issue of fatigue, radar alarms on the bridge had been deactivated. The issue of fatigue and inadequate hours of work and rest for seafarers is well known and discussed in the industry, but a combination of commercial pressures and minimum crewing levels has meant that they have failed to be addressed. This incident involving a quality ship owner like Hafnia highlights the very real dangers the industry faces from failing to get a proper handle on the issue of seafarer fatigue.
Yeah, it's interesting that you raised the issue of alarms there and the alarms being deactivated. I covered a Lloyd's Register report that came out this month on that very topic about seafarers being overwhelmed by all of the alarms. I think they followed something like a dozen vessels over however many days, and there were tens, I think it was 40 million alarm events that they tracked and looked at how many there were per hour and what the recommended number were and how many were happening during those hours of rest where seafarers should be getting some kip or some downtime but are being interrupted by these alarms. Well worth checking out that one as well, as it all ties into the same topic.
Indeed, that's an astonishing number of alarms as well. If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice.
Week 2. The year is already slipping away. Insurer Allianz released its annual risk barometer, which charts the risks to business that are keeping business leaders and insurers up at night. Regulatory changes top the list for the maritime and shipping sector, which I presume is a nod to tariffs and the IMO net zero framework and everything else going on in the regulatory world. Natural disasters, artificial intelligence, cyber incidents, and business interruption, including supply chain disruption, rounded out the top 5 risks for those marine and shipping respondents. While the overall list for all the businesses they surveyed had cyber risks and AI in the first and second slots, the two clearly being linked as AI kind of increases the capabilities of the cyber criminals. Ransomware attacks were the chief among the concerns of business leaders in that cyber area, and there have been plenty of high-profile incidents in 2025 to support those particular fears. It was interesting for the shipping side of things that of those top 5 risks, only natural disasters was actually featured in both 2025 and 2026. The rest of these years' worries all being new entrants to the sector. Political risks and climate change were 2 of those that dropped out of the top 5 in 2026, and perhaps a bit surprised to see political risk dropping out given the current climate, but that's what the survey brought up.
I must say I agree. I am surprised to see that. I'm going to sort of come to an annual event that we always cover, and that's the Singapore Maritime Foundation's New Year Conversations. It gathers together the great and the good of the industry with several hundred senior executives from local Singapore companies and international companies that are in Singapore and beyond, including CEOs from ship owners, managers, and service providers. Kind of the full range of the industry. Now, the event itself is held under the Chatham House rules, which means reporting of discussions is somewhat limited, but a show of hands from the audience on a question about the IMO net zero framework was quite revealing. The question, who thinks this is a 1-year setback and who thinks this is going to be a longer-term deferral? Those who were positive about the prospects were asked to raise their hands. From the vantage point of where Seatrade Maritime News was sat, no hands were visibly raised. So it's fair to say the feelings of the audience were overwhelmingly negative on the future of the IMO net zero framework.
Interesting reversal of the positivity that we had going into the extraordinary MEPC meeting. I wonder if we'll get it wrong again and it'll be fine this time around.
I wouldn't put my money on that one.
I'll take us into week 3. We've had a bit of a Red Sea hokey-cokey going on from CMA CGM in the first weeks of 2026, as the container line announced some services were quitting the Cape of Good Hope diversion and returning to the Red Sea, only to announce soon after that the services were returning to the Red Sea routing again. The decision on whether or not to use the shorter Red Sea route and face the risk of attack from Yemen's Houthi is clearly being closely watched, as it will have huge significance for container freight markets. I believe Nick Savides wrote that there are around 2 million TEU of capacity currently being soaked up by taking that longer route around Africa. And after a period of heavy new building delivery, the spectre of overcapacity looms large over the container lines. There's a very real prospect of them having to start to eat into that sort of dragon's hoard of gold that they earned in the pandemic aftermath, and since the Red Sea diversions were put in place and kind of delayed the return to losing money that we all expected at that time. The first signs of return were seen late last year, and CMA CGM and Maersk were among those that tentatively started sending ships back through Suez. But the situation in the Middle East remains tense. The Houthi did threaten to fire on merchant ships. I don't think it was a direct threat, but sort of indirectly, as the US builds up its naval presence in the region and continues to put pressure on Iran. Our container man, Nick Savides, is following the container line's Red Sea strategies closely. It's contained in most of his sort of rate-based stories. Keep an eye on his updates for any news, as well as how freight rates are moving in this complicated situation.
Yeah, no, there's some great coverage from Nick, so do keep an eye out for that. I'm going to be turning to a rather sad incident that occurred in the third week of the month, and that was the sudden capsizing and sinking of the 13-year-old bulker Devon Bay on a voyage between southern Philippines and China that almost immediately bore the signs of cargo liquefaction. Of the 21 crew of Filipino nationals on the vessel, there were 15 survivors rescued by the China Coast Guard, and also 2 bodies recovered. 4 more seafarers, including the master, remain missing. The Devon Bay's owner, K-Line's Singapore-based ship-owning company, confirmed that the vessel was carrying a cargo of nickel ore. While the cause of the incident is yet to be confirmed, cargo liquefaction is believed to be the most likely cause, and is an issue that has plagued the nickel ore and bauxite trades from the Philippines and Indonesia to China. Despite being a multi-billion-dollar trade, port facilities are primitive, with nickel ore mined in open-cast mines and then stored out in the open on beaches, leaving it exposed to monsoon conditions in the southern Philippines. Tests are supposed to be carried out by the mines to ensure that transportable moisture level is within safe limits, but there are questions about the adequacy of such tests, and in the past P&I clubs warned that certificates were frequently forged. There are also stories of surveyors being threatened with violence, shipmasters being threatened with violence if they don't carry cargoes, because it's a pretty lawless part of the world. The Devon Bay looks set to add to a depressing list of liquefaction casualties, which, according to Intercargo statistics, of 20 bulk carrier total losses between 2015 and 2024 were responsible for 55 of a total of 89 seafarer deaths. Like many serious issues in shipping, it's well known and highlighted, but little ever seems to be done to stop the incidents from being repeated.
Yeah, I think I said to you, Marcus, when I was, catching up with the stories one morning and read this one, it seemed really odd for a 13-year-old bulker to go down, because I think it was initially reported to be carrying iron ore, is that right? And I thought, well, something strange has happened here. But as soon as I got to the piece in your story that said it may well have been nickel ore, I immediately thought, oh, I sort of know what might have happened here, which shows just how understood it is as a risk, and perhaps more could be done. I'll take us into the final week of January, however, with a bit of a positive note, for me at least as a fan of wind propulsion. We had a spate of stories land about repeat orders in the wind-assisted propulsion arena, with Econowind bagging orders for 2 more ships from Chemship, and Anemoy announcing the successful installation of one of its systems on a second vessel for Berger Bulk. Just a day or so before that, Bound for Blue announced the first installation of its sails on a Maersk Tankers vessel, and that's the first in a 5-ship deal for them. As the various wind propulsion companies noted, these repeat orders are a sign of confidence from those ship owners who are already using the systems and know the most about them. You have to assume that the fuel and emission savings are being delivered as promised if further installations and investments are being made. And just to pick up on something I covered slightly earlier in the month, DNV's figures on the 2025 order book noted a growth in wind-assisted propulsion systems last year. A total of 24 ships in 2025 with wind-assisted propulsion tallied 63 sails, an increase over 22 ships with 49 sails installed in 2024.
Well, my final pick, I struggle to describe as positive, but I guess it is if you own a Dark Fleet ship. I'm coming back to an issue I mentioned earlier in the episode. Dark Fleet vessels anchored off the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia. Now, while the US, Europe, and the UK may be starting to crack down on false flag vessels carrying sanctioned cargoes from the source markets of such cargoes, Venezuela and Russia, the receiving end of the Dark Fleet trades are very much alive and well. The area inside Malaysia's EEZ is a favoured place for VLCCs and other large tankers in the Dark Fleet to anchor and carry out ship-to-ship transfers to vessels that then are onward bound to China and other North Asian destinations. Talking to Charlie Brown, Senior Advisor of Shipping for United Against a Nuclear Iran, who tracks the activity in the region, he has been able to confirm around 60 ships laden with Iranian oil in the area, and another 30 vessels with cargoes from Russia and Venezuela waiting for ship-to-ship transfer operations. The number of SDS pairs that Brown is observing has doubled to around 13 to 15 in recent weeks, compared to 5 to 7 a year earlier. The situation around these SDS operations is a murky one, and vessels often try to crudely cover their identities with tarpaulins. We have photos of that on the story on the site, over the ship name on the hull. Malaysia appears to turn a blind eye to the activity, even though it did promise a crackdown in midway through last year. The majority of the vessels are either false flag or have no known registration, which means the US could potentially board them in international waters in this region, but it remains to see if it would up the ante in that way, particularly if you think about an area like the South China Sea. That would be hugely controversial from a geopolitical point of view. And with that is all we have time for on this episode of Maritime in Minutes. Links to all the stories discussed are in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.